Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and it's time for my 1,000 subscriber special. Or rather, it's past time for my 1,000 subscriber special. I'll be honest, I was planning on doing this as my 1,000 subscriber special, but didn't think I would hit 1,000 as quickly as I did, so I didn't have the requisite background footage needed. But you've probably seen the thumbnail and title, so you know what we're here for. I am ranking all of the Fire Emblem games, including the spin-offs. I want to be clear off the bat that this tier list is going to be, by its very nature, extremely subjective. After all, it's just about how much I personally enjoy these games, instead of how well they're made or something like that that would be slightly more objective, although if we're being honest, there isn't really a way to objectively rank all of the Fire Emblem games. To go more into my criteria, I will be factoring in things like the story, the replayability, the experience and enjoyment on a blind playthrough, as well as the experience and enjoyment on subsequent playthroughs, the accessibility of challenge runs, and, because I'm me, how enjoyable the game is to 0% growths. I also want to clarify that I like basically every game in the Fire Emblem series, and even the ones on the bottom end of the tier list, I enjoy playing when I get around to them. While I will probably be highlighting the things that I dislike about the lower ranked games as opposed to the things that I like about them, at the end of the day, Fire Emblem is still Fire Emblem, and there is a base level of enjoyment that I have for basically every game in the series. Without any further ado, let's dive in. Number 24. Fire Emblem Heroes. Fire Emblem Heroes is the reason that I use the word most in the introductory section. I believe this game to be fully irredeemable. From the gameplay perspective, it is uninteresting to me. The maps are incredibly small, the movement ranges are incredibly small, and the walls of text that make up skills and power creep are just not what I'm here for in Fire Emblem. However, the bigger problem is the gambling gacha aspect of the game. The gacha system is inherently unethical as it preys on so-called whales in order to extract as much money from them as possible, often money that they do not have or cannot afford to be spending on a mobile game. In particular, this tends to target young people, neurodivergent people, and people with gambling addictions. It's a disgusting business model, and while Fire Emblem Heroes does provide us with some cool art, I pray every day for its downfall, which will unfortunately never happen. I want to clarify, if you enjoy playing Heroes, it doesn't make you a bad person. I personally can't stomach it just because of what the game represents, but the villains here are intelligent systems, not the people who are playing it. Also, they apparently do some weird stuff with some of the alts where they attach rather adult themes to characters who are like 10 years old or younger canonically. I don't want to get too into the specifics of it because I don't want YouTube to flag this video for me talking about it, but it's some criminal stuff, and so that also, I controversial stance, I don't like that. Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about Heroes. I played it for all of like 2 days back when it first came out, and it's clearly not for me, and all the ethical stuff attached to it just makes it pretty firmly in the bottom tier, and the only Fire Emblem game I think has 0 value. Number 23. BSFE. BSFE, or Berwick Saga Fire Emblem, is a Satellaview game, and it's a rather interesting experiment, but in my opinion, a pretty severely failing one. It contains 4 maps where the objective is simply to get points over a period of time, and I said time, not turns, because it is actually time limited. It has some voice acting, which is interesting, and it was through the Satellaview, which was a weird retro thing that would use satellite to download the episodes that were available for a limited time, so it's interesting, but in general I don't find it particularly fun to play Fire Emblem in the objective of just gather points by getting kills over time. It's unavailable to play legitimately, and emulating it is extremely complicated, to the point where I didn't feel like doing it all over again, so what you are seeing on screen is the recreations of the maps in the Fire Emblem 12 bonus content. This took the maps from BSFE and made them a more traditional Fire Emblem thing with traditional Fire Emblem objectives, as opposed to the score-based ones, and It's still not great, but it's better than BSFE. Still, despite all of its significant flaws, I'm glad that Intelligent Systems experimented with BSFE because it is truly a relic of a weird age, and I kind of love that for it. Not too much to say about this one either, just because the game in question doesn't have a lot of content. It's 4 maps and they're all very similar. Number 22, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. This is the first of the mainline Fire Emblem games, and the majority of the reason for it being down here is simply aspects of it that have not aged well. It lacks a lot of the quality of life that even its immediate successors, Fire Emblem 2 and 3, have, as well as just playing extremely slowly. This is partially due to the slow speed of the hardware, which requires the computer to sit and think for a long time, partially due to aesthetic choices such as the enemies moving the cursor, which causes the screen to drag around even longer, and partially due to the fact that item management is an extreme chore, to the extent where I don't think it would be inaccurate to describe item management as one of the key gameplay features of Fire Emblem 1. For the uninitiated, every unit in your army has 4 inventory slots. However, trading does not function like it does in other Fire Emblem games. In order to trade items between units, you need to have one unit use their turn to give a single item to another unit with an empty inventory slot. You cannot do a two-way trade, and you cannot do a trade where you take an item. You can only do a trade where you give. Giving a single item consumes a unit's entire turn, so swapping items around is pretty high cost in terms of your time and also action economy. Additionally, in order to empty out full inventories, you either give an item to a unit who has an empty inventory slot or put it in the convoy. You can only access the convoy from specific convoy tiles, as the convoy functions like a third type of shop in addition to shops and armories. Technically speaking, using the convoy does cost gold, although this is extremely trivial as the game gives you so much gold that you are never going to run out of it. In a typical Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light playthrough, I feel like you spend about half of the map just doing convoy management, and personally, I do not think that managing these units' inventory is a particularly fun aspect of gameplay. Don't get me wrong, I do think that there is a way to make inventory management interesting and fun. The Last Promise does it, or Resident Evil 4 is famous for having inventory management be a key aspect of the gameplay, but to me, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light simply falls short of doing so. As for the non-inventory related things, it's a passable Fire Emblem game. The unit balance is all over the place, but personally I like that in a Fire Emblem cast. Marth is pretty much the strongest unit in the cast, which is pretty cool for him. He has I guess you would call it a, provoke ability, where enemies will always attack him if they have the ability to, which can allow for some fairly interesting strategies where you use frail units to kill and then not have to worry about them taking damage on enemy phase. There's also some fun brokenness in the form of the many glitches. There is the famous credits warp glitch if you're interested in speedrunning Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, but more interesting to me are the glitches that you do if you are not credits warping. Famously, Bantu can get infinite defense, as can Tiki and Zane if Zane transforms into a dragon. The Pure Water glitch allows all of the units in your army to cap their resistance permanently, and this in turn breaks the AI. The Geosphere actually deals random damage to all enemies and doesn't damage your own units. The inventory management system makes warp skips more interesting than they would be otherwise, and the stat boosters available in Fire Emblem 1 are notoriously broken, giving absurd amounts of stats, especially for a game where most stats cap at 20. It's notable that resistance caps at 7, but that is probably because no unit in the game can actually gain resistance, and the only way to have your resistance stat altered is through the Barrier Staff, Pure Water, or the Pure Water glitch. All in all, I do really enjoy Fire Emblem 1 for a lot of its oddities, although the UI being pretty terrible, the gameplay being incredibly slow, and the inventory management falling flat when it is really a key aspect of the gameplay just puts this as my least favorite mainline game to play. Worth noting, the 0% run of this is incredibly fun and interesting because it kind of requires you to make use of a lot of the extremely strange tools and glitches that Fire Emblem 1 gives you access to. And as I mentioned, setting up warp skips in this game is interesting due to the fact you can't trade the warp staff around. Still, I would probably only recommend this game to people who love the series and want to see its roots. It's not that there's no value here, but what value there is lumped in with a lot of frustration and tedium. Number 21, Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade. Alright, just a disclaimer, this is probably going to be the most negative section of the video, as I have a strong dislike for Fire Emblem 7. In an attempt to compliment sandwich my scathing takedown of Fire Emblem 7, I'll start by saying that the characters in this game are pretty fun to spend time with. Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector in particular are a fun trio of lords, and I really enjoy their interactions, and it feels like a real friendship among people who do have some beef with each other occasionally, but I don't know, it feels lived in. It does not feel like the sort of generic we are friends forever of some of the modern Fire Emblems, but I also appreciate that these characters actually do like each other instead of seemingly just being saddled with each other because they're on the same side of a conflict. The secondary and tertiary cast members are also pretty fun, but it's hard for me to get attached to them because I don't really care for the game that they are in. The minute-to-minute gameplay of Fire Emblem 7 is extremely frustrating to me. It's a GBA Fire Emblem, so there's kind of a floor in terms of how bad it can be, but I feel like it hits that floor pretty consistently. I don't care for most of the maps, as a lot of them heavily rely on gimmicks, such as Pale Flower of Darkness or Night of Farewells, or result in incredibly weak enemy spam, such as Crazed Beast. While I don't think that a gimmick map is inherently bad on its own, I think that the gimmicks that Fire Emblem 7 chooses to put in its gimmick maps are all poorly executed or just bad ideas from the start. Rain and snow are the ones most often cited, and yeah, I agree, they are pretty shit. But I also think that the Kashuna maps are annoying, maps where there's only one enemy type, such as the Magical Barrage on Cog of Destiny, or the Berserker Barrage in Value of Life tend to annoy me. The Wyvern Party Defend map where Vida shows up is kind of just boring. And in fact, that could be said for a lot of the game. Many of the maps are just boring, either sit there and defend or avoid enemies for 7 turns, or route maps / siege maps where almost no enemies pose a threat to any of your units. The strategy of handing a cavalier a javelin or hand axe and just sitting back while they delete all of the foes is in full effect in portions of Fire Emblem 7, and yeah, I'm not a fan of that. I want to actually have to engage with strategy in my strategy RPGs. That said, during the few instances where the game does attempt to give you a difficulty spike, I feel like it is poorly executed in the other direction. There are a couple of side objectives and one main objective where the game decides to give you an extremely tight deadline that you need to hit, and almost every one of these feels like it is bordering on unfair. The earliest example that I can think of is in Hector Mode Chapter 17, Whereabouts Unknown. There's a chest that contains a silver blade, and Marcus basically needs to move full move every turn in order to catch the thief on time. However, the most notorious instance of this is in Battle Before Dawn, quite possibly the most poorly designed map in all of Fire Emblem. In theory, a map like this could be interesting, the idea being that you and your army need to rush forward to protect a fragile unit while other enemies are closing in on them, and if you fail to protect them, then you lose. Unfortunately, multiple aspects of this come together to make it into a frustrating and, to an extent, luck-reliant map. In order to reach Zephiel before the enemies that will kill him show up, you need to move your high move units full move or nearly full move every turn. Unfortunately, as this is a Fog of War map, you will sometimes run into enemies that ambush you and end your movement early. If this happens too many times, you don't reach Zephiel in time and he gets killed. While you can alleviate this a little bit with a torch staff or torches or thief vision, it's not possible to fully play around. unless you have the map layout memorized or have it open in another window. The game also pulls some mean tricks, such as having its 2 extremely tough bosses waiting in places where they are likely able to rush forward and attack you, and seemingly just out of spite, putting a low % crit chance on the monk who is fighting Nino. While Battle Before Dawn is certainly the worst map in Fire Emblem 7, I think that it is far from the exception, and is in fact reflective of the general quality of the Fire Emblem 7 maps. That said, there is one standout that I really enjoy, and that is Dragon's Gate. Dragon's Gate is far and away my favorite map in Fire Emblem 7, and I would go so far as to say that it is one of the better maps in the GBA era of Fire Emblem. While it does feature an incredibly tight turn count if you want to get Legault and the member card, it gives you some flexibility and multiple approaches in terms of how you want to get to the boss. I also appreciate the frustration of having the 1 tile wide choke point turned around on you. Now you are rushing to try to get somewhere quickly, but if you aren't careful, you're going to end up in a traffic jam and the thieves are going to get away. Still, for me, this one good map isn't enough to elevate Fire Emblem 7, especially because if I want a difficult Fire Emblem on the GBA, I play Fire Emblem 6, and if I want a fun turn your brain off popcorn food Fire Emblem on the GBA, I play Sacred Stones. So there's not that much that draws me to play Fire Emblem 7. At the end of the day, I still kind of enjoy myself when I get around to playing it, but significantly less than I do other Fire Emblems, so I feel like that pretty solidly puts it on the lower end of my rankings. Number 20. Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. I want to get this out of the way at the start. I consider the 3 different routes in the Fire Emblem Fates to be 3 separate games. While they are technically part of the Fates game as a whole, they were sold separately from each other, contain completely different casts, and for the most part different levels, even if some of them use recycled maps. To me, this feels fundamentally different from Fire Emblem Three Houses, which has the same cast, just different join times and some exclusivity on routes, and most of the same chapters with a few variations depending on which route you went on, only starting in the end game. With all of that being said, Birthright is by far the weakest of the trilogy. The majority of the maps in Birthright are route maps, which is already my least favorite objective, as I find it to be incredibly tedious, especially if, as is the case in Birthright, many enemies are not aggressive until you enter their attack ranges. It's also one of, if not the easiest Fire Emblem game out there. On the hardest difficulty, Lunatic, enemies in the early game will probably be threatening to the majority of your cast, but they will not keep up, as enemy growths do not even come close to your unit's growths. As you begin to outpace the enemies, any and all challenge in routing the maps is kind of gone. Like, yeah, there are a few difficulty spikes here and there, namely the 2 Camilla maps and the map where you are fighting Iago, but even these maps are pretty easily trivialized by a base level Ryoma. Oh yeah, I haven't even talked about the lobster in the room. Ryoma is handed to you about a third of the way through the game, and he is ready to delete everything other than the final map, just as is. He has an incredibly broken 1-2 range sword, which is rare for Fates. Starts as a Swordmaster, which is actually a good class for once, although he can also go Pegasus Knight or Cavalier if you care about the movement, and he can go basically anything if he marries Corrin, which is generally advisable because if he marries Corrin, then Corrin can just become a dedicated backpack while Ryoma solos the game. This is basically the strategy that I use for my 0% growths, but it is also kind of the easiest way to beat Birthright and the, in my opinion, least tedious way to beat Birthright. If you are only moving 1 unit throughout the map, then you're spending less time and less brain cells engaging with the map, and the map does really not demand much engagement. Because of how distinctly powerful Ryoma is at base, especially for the time when he joins, a lot of people will posit that the existence of Ryoma is the reason that Birthright is so easy. And that's partially true, but I also think that the low enemy quality and the distinct lack of aggression on the majority of maps contributes to this in a big way. There's a reason why the majority of the cast can solo with very little investment. In truth, Ryoma's most standout quality is the fact that he has access to good 1-2 range in a non-magical class, as the other good candidates for soloing either have to settle for not having access to 1-2 range on this extremely enemy phase-focused game, or end up going into a class that can use scrolls. In particular, Oni Chieftain is a good one for that since it is very bulky, and soloing the game tends to be the easiest way to beat it. I know that this is a principle that applies to many other Fire Emblems, but Birthright is just a chore to engage with, at least for me, so I'm really drawn to the soloing portion of it. The early game I do actually enjoy because the enemies, as I say, can pose a threat to you, but after like 3 or 4 chapters, all of that just goes away. And the game's idea of difficulty in the late game is just to spam you with even more enemy reinforcements, which doesn't end up being difficult, just ends up being tedious. It is worth noting as well that I'm not particularly attached to too many of the Birthright characters. There's some of them who I like for their crit quotes or their aesthetics, but digging deep into the supports, I don't really care for this cast, I'm sorry. I know that it has its fans, and obviously a character's likability is extremely subjective, so if you are a big fan of someone like Sakura or Takumi, then that's awesome for you, and like, go off. I love when people find characters that they love. Genuinely happy that you find enjoyment from these people, but it just doesn't do it for me. And the story is just... I don't like the story. In general, I don't think any of the stories in Fates are especially good, but Birthrights commits to me the cardinal sin of being both bad and boring. At least Conquest and Revelations go off the deep end so insanely that you can laugh at them and make fun of them, like watching Troll 2 or The Room. But Birthright is a fairly standard, generic fantasy story, a cast that I don't have any attachment to, and writing that just leaves a lot to be desired. It's a shame too because I'm a huge fan of the East Asian and in particular Japanese aesthetic, and hope that we get more Fire Emblem games taking place in somewhere that isn't just medieval Europe, but this time there's dragons. And I have tried really hard to like Birthright, but it just doesn't do it for me. Also worth noting that the final map having an insane difficulty spike is complete bullshit, and I hate it. Like, I know I spent the majority of this portion complaining about how the ways in which Birthright is easy makes it boring, but the ways in which it makes the final map difficult is also boring. Dragon Garen and regular Garen are just insane stat checks, as are all of the enemies in the room, and really the only way to interact with that map is to solo it with Ryoma, even if you've trained up other people to solo maps. It's just not fun, honestly. It's just not fun. The way this game does easy is boring, and the way this game does difficulty is boring. Not for me. Next. Number 19, Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War. Much like Birthright, this is a game I want to love, but can't, albeit for different reasons. While Birthright draws to me due to its aesthetic being extremely different from other Fire Emblems, FE4 draws to me due to the fact that it experiments with a lot of creative ideas in the gameplay. The premier one, of course, being the inheritance system, which involves characters passing down holy blood, inventories, skills, stuff like that, and a build-your-own-child system that, while being less complicated than Fates and Awakening, took place much earlier in the franchise and laid the foundation for what was to come. Additionally, things like Pursuit, Road Tiles, the Pawn Shop system, and the Arenas are all very unique ideas that on the surface I kind of like, but in practice sort of fall off for me. Managing arenas and inventories at the start of every chapter ends up feeling pretty tedious to me. I know that it is technically optional, but it is also extremely optimal, and you will struggle to have units keep up in both gold and experience if you don't at least try to get them through a few rounds of the arena. In general, it feels like it adds about 15 to 20 minutes before every map of additional preparations, and while most Fire Emblem games involve a lot of work in the preparations in terms of choosing what units and inventories and, in some cases, tonics you give them, it tends not to be as time-consuming as running your entire squad through the arena, especially as you get later into Fire Emblem 4. In a similar vein, road tiles adding to your movement ends up just widening the gap in between horses and unhorsed units, and this is even more so because of how large the maps in Fire Emblem 4 are. I do kind of like the idea that you're on a giant battlefield that's constantly evolving, but I feel that Fire Emblem 4 actually fails to make good use of its large maps for the majority of the time. There are a few maps where things are happening at multiple ends of them at the same time. The big standout is Chapter 7, where you have 3 separate groups handling different threats simultaneously. Selith's group is fighting some Dark Mages, Shannon and Patty have to deal with Mercs and Dark Mages coming for them on the cliffside, while Leaf, Finn, and Nana are holding off a bunch of Armor Knights that are attacking them for the majority of the map until you come rescue them with Selith. However, this proves to be the exception rather than the rule, as even in the one instance where you're sort of determined to defend multiple castles, the only penalty for failure is a loss of some gold, and it's fairly easy to get people back there since you have movement staffs, and it just becomes like a defend the throne situation. For the majority of Fire Emblem 4's runtime, you could pretty easily replace the large chapter with several small chapters, each one representing a single castle. People have suggested that they should do this in the remake, and I actually feel the opposite. I think that they should change the maps of Fire Emblem 4 so that they make better use of the fact that they are large and could have things going on multiple fronts at the same time. For example, in Chapter 8 of Fire Emblem 4, once you seize the second to last castle, Hawk, or Sed if you're cringe, spawns at the last castle to defend it from a bunch of wyverns. What if instead he spawns his blue unit at the beginning of the map and needs to defend the place from wyverns while the rest of your squad is advancing forward to try to capture the other 2 castles so that they can get to him as well? Maybe you could even have something like your Pegasus Knight can fly over to help him, which would be very in character since the 2 of them are siblings. Unfortunately, the game as it currently stands just doesn't have that many opportunities that take advantage of the large maps, so they end up just feeling like sprawling messes that cause a already long game to feel even more bloated than it actually is. Speaking of the length, the long animation time, including some instances where green units are fighting red units for extended portions of time, is not something I'm a huge fan of. Multiple maps feature sections, usually at the beginning, although sometimes also in the middle, especially for chapters 4 and 2, where the only thing you're doing is moving your entire army and not dealing with any enemies. This is incredibly boring. While for people on a ranked run, it can kind of sometimes be an interesting exercise of moving anyone as far as you can while also keeping the pairings next to each other, in a casual playthrough, it is just boring. You're not going to have trouble hitting your romantic pairings if you are keeping them in mind, and you're just moving full move, end turn, moving full move, end turn, moving full move, end turn, doing it over and over and over again, and it's so life draining. I also feel like the customization aspect of Fire Emblem 4 is a little bit overblown, as for most units there is a single optimal pairing that you want to have, and while you can do some variations and occasionally there is merit, it usually feels like you're hurting yourself or not really making anything more interesting. With all of that criticism out of the way, I want to make it clear that I absolutely do enjoy playing this game. As I stated at the beginning, even when I'm playing a Fire Emblem game that's on the lower end of my Fire Emblem games, it's still a Fire Emblem game, and I'm still going to enjoy it. There's just a lot more bothering me and getting in the way while I am doing so. I do also want to touch on Fire Emblem 4's story. I think that there are some great moments that elevate it. In particular, there are several moments in Chapter 5 that stand out, but also some character interactions between Deirdre and Sigurd, as well as Lewin and Aaron, and Lewin and Sigurd, and Lewin and his mother, and just a lot of Lewin stuff that really works for me. But I also think that the story is overly reliant on info dumps, in particular info dumps that you get long before they're relevant, and I just don't think that's a good way to tell a story. If I'm reading through a wall of people and places as opposed to experiencing the events myself or watching them unfold, I mean, it's called show not tell for a reason. Also, Generation 2 is incredibly boring and takes the political intrigue that we had in Generation 1 and instead folds it into a series of castles to be conquered and then new castles to be conquered also. There's a couple of things that hint at character moments with people like Ares and Seliph or Leif and Altena, but honestly, it kind of falls flat to me because they're not particularly developed, and the focus is just on, we found a new territory to conquer, we've conquered a new territory, let's move on to the next one. As this is a game that is rumored to have a remake pretty soon, I am hoping that they do a lot to touch up the story, similarly to how they did with Echoes compared to Gaiden's story. While I wasn't a fan of every change that Echoes made, I do appreciate that they tried to add depth and new characters, and hope that any Fire Emblem 4 remake that theoretically shows up would do the same. Number 18, Fire Emblem Awakening. Okay, I know it's going to upset some people that I put Fire Emblem Awakening above Fire Emblem 4, but just remember this is an opinion-based list. It is not in any way, shape, or form trying to be objective. That said, the way I feel about the game that saved the franchise is actually very similar to my feelings about Fire Emblem 4. Both games have a story with an interesting premise that fails in execution. Both games have very interesting mechanics that just sort of fall apart thanks to the map design, and both are games that I enjoy playing, but would rather play other Fire Emblem games in the end. Let's tackle Awakening's story first. I hardcore love the idea of going back to Arcanea millennia after the Marth games. Seeing the ways that the continent and the culture have changed over time, recognizing landmarks and corresponding how they line up to the FE1, FE11, etc. games is incredibly fun. And part of me hopes that they experiment with this idea again on a different setting. Maybe we get to see Alib or Magvel far in the future and what became of them. Additionally, while I know a lot of people harp on the time travel aspect of Awakening, I think that is a really cool concept, and I love the idea of warping in the child units from the future in order to give the pairing system without giving a generational time skip. I'm a sucker for a good time travel story, and the idea of going back in time to save the world from a post-apocalyptic future is, while fairly standard, the foundation for a lot of very fun time travel stories. I mean, just look at Terminator. That said, I think the story of Awakening runs into three major issues. The first is that the main characters generally don't behave according to how you would expect their character motivations to. Lucina is the biggest victim of this. I think the writers decided that she would be going back in time to try to alter the future, but then just decided to have her arbitrarily alter things instead of take a course of action that would make sense. Like, one of the earliest ways she tries to alter the future is preventing Chrom from getting reinforcements for the war that he's in against Plagia, and I get that changes things, but wouldn't it just make it more likely for Chrom to die instead of less likely? Other characters randomly get handed the idiot ball, like Cyrie's brother, or Flavia, or whoever at whatever point, but in general, if the plot demands that a character act in a way that does not fit their motivation, they will do it. On the topic of Cyrie's brother, Act 2 is entirely too long and makes Act 3 feel squeezed in comparison. While it's not unheard of for Fire Emblem games to have some sort of detour, for example in Path of Radiance, the entire time that you spend in Begnion fighting Oliver is a distraction from the main battle against the Dane army, Awakening's Walhart arc stands out as it is over a third of the game, and that's before factoring in any child paralogs that you might unlock along the way, extending the story even further. This results in the third act, which should be the most important part, getting extremely truncated, although perhaps that is for the best because the third act is home to the third major issue that I have with Awakening's plot, the fact that it seems more interested in pulling twists out of its ass than telling a compelling and competent story. In general, I'm not a fan of a twist for a twist's sake. Like, if a twist is executed well and recontextualizes things, or is surprising and well foreshadowed, then yes, I'm all here for it. But if the twist is just this person faked their death so that they could steal a stone to prevent a summoning, but then it turns out the summoning happens anyway because the stone wasn't needed, and also 17 other behind-the-scenes things happen because of the power of friendship, it tunes me out, and I can no longer engage with these characters seriously, which is a shame because, like, a lot of the stuff that got set up in the first act and even the beginning of the third act was really interesting, but they just sort of throw it away because the plot demands that these things happen. I love the idea of them attempting to change the fate and destiny, and the fact that Robin's relationship with Crom and the rest of the Shepherds is the reason that she didn't succumb to evil. Like, it's corny and power of friendship stuff, but it works on a certain level. But it's surrounded by a bunch of nonsense that it really detracts from any investment I can have in the story. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about the story of Awakening as opposed to the gameplay, and that's because I don't really have that much to say about the gameplay that hasn't already been said. It is a series of route and kill boss maps. The terrain in the maps tends to be fairly non-existent, and the go-to strategy is to go into one of several broken builds, such as Nosferatu tanking or Glass Sword's arm thrifting, and just delete everything that comes at you. Awakening's iteration of pair-up is also notoriously unbalanced, which does detract a little bit from the difficulty, although to be honest, I enjoy playing with broken toys, so if it weren't for the fact that the maps were so poorly designed, then I would enjoy this game a lot more. I know this is a lot of people's first Fire Emblem, and a lot of people have an emotional attachment to it or the characters, but they just don't work for me as well as they do other people. That said, as the disclaimer at the beginning said, it's still a Fire Emblem game, I still enjoy it, I still replay it pretty frequently. It's just lower on the list than the others because it's competing with other Fire Emblem games, and like all the Fire Emblem games are based, so, you know. Number 17, Fire Emblem 3, Mystery of the Emblem. Full disclosure, this one might move once I finally finish a playthrough of Book 2, because I haven't done that yet. I've done Book 1 several times, and I've gotten partway through Book 2, but I just haven't gotten around to finishing it, sorry. That said, I can comment on what I like about the mechanics, as they are actually pretty nice, especially for an older Fire Emblem game. I like the split weapon and item inventory, although part of that is the Tellius nostalgia in me. I like the idea of dismounting and how that changes things. That said, the star spheres are incredibly broken, and the caps being 20 mean that the units end up feeling somewhat homogenous, other than the fact that they're in different classes from each other. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of items that alter a unit's growth rates anyway, but I especially dislike Fire Emblem 3's iteration because it seems to just be so swingy. Like, seriously, every unit in this game can cap all the relevant stats very easily. It's kind of crazy and fun to do, but it's also just sort of, I don't know, it limits replayability because the units tend to sort of blend together. All the pegs feel the same, all the wyverns feel the same, all the warriors feel the same. Oh wait, no, there's not any warriors because they got rid of axes as well. I mean, I guess that's kind of funny. I do love the idea of silver axes just being bullions. I should touch on Book 1 as well. I am counting it a little bit in this ranking since it is the one that I have the most experience on. It's a cleaned up version of Fire Emblem 1, and yeah, I like it for that. I think I would prefer to play it over Fire Emblem 1, although I know that's not super high praise. Yeah, I don't really have too much to say about this. It's just sort of a game that I feel neutrally about and don't have enough experience with to give a super in-depth analysis. I'm sorry to the FE3 heads out there. I promise I'm trying. I will get around to it, and I will talk about my thoughts on it once I do. Numbers 16 and 15, Fire Emblem Warriors, and Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. I'm covering these two together because my thoughts on them are very similar to each other. 3 Hopes gets a tiny bit of an edge because I prefer its cast to the cast of Vanilla Warriors, but honestly, I would have preferred a game with a huge crossover cast. I just don't like the representatives that they chose for Vanilla Warriors. Fates, Awakening, and FE1 just don't have casts that I really vibe with. I know they're popular characters, and if you like them, once again, I'm really happy for you, but it just doesn't do it for me. As for the gameplay itself, it is fun in a sort of mindless way. It's a weird one to rank on this list because it scratches an entirely different itch than any of the Fire Emblem games. I guess this is kind of the gatekeeper for which Fire Emblem games I think are incredibly fun to play for the tactics and which ones I don't, as everything below it is either tactically uninteresting to me or has such minimal tactical input that I play it for other reasons. But yeah, I am a big fan of spamming combos in the Warrior games. It's a nice popcorn food game, if you know what I mean. I turn my brain off, I run around, kill a bunch of enemies, but I have to pay enough attention to accomplish the objective, so it's not quite a movie. I don't really know what to say about it. It's not that Warriors and Three Hopes aren't really different from each other. Like, Three Hopes has a lot of base management stuff and assigning different resources and reclassing characters, whereas Warriors cares more about managing supports in order to get skills and has a very extensive post-game where you go through a ton of different Fire Emblem maps from history, but all of the Warrior games kind of blend together for me. I usually play on hard or normal as opposed to like the super hard difficulties that you unlock after clears, simply because I want to be able to pay little enough attention that if I mess up, it's not the biggest deal in the world. It's also worth noting that the Warriors games are very much a sometimes treat for me, and it's unlikely that I'll ever go back to ones that I already cleared. The reason you're seeing only footage from Three Hopes is because I'm not going back to Vanilla Warriors because I already did everything I need in it. And once I finish Three Hopes, next time Warriors game scratches my itch, I will probably do Age of Calamity because I enjoyed Vanilla Hyrule Warriors, so why not try the sequel? That said, if we do get a true Warriors 2, I would love for it to be a crossover event similar to Warriors 1, instead of just taking all of the characters from a single setting. I am glad that we got some more insight to the characters from Three Houses, but honestly, I would much prefer to see how Hector interacts with Ike or stuff like that. I've got a lot of beloved characters from various settings, and I just would love to see them interact with each other. It is one of the joys of Engage to be able to see these characters outside of their homeworld, so in a setting where they're not only outside of their homeworld, but can all interact with each other, like, I don't know, that would be baller. That is the appeal of the old school Fire Emblem Warriors to me. Well, did I just call it old school? It's not that old school, it was a Switch game. You know what I mean, the original one. Yeah, please bring that back. Like, yeah, please do that. Intelligence Systems, Koei Tecmo, come on, get on it. Do Warriors 2. Have Ike and Hector kiss. You won't, you fucking cowards, you won't. Cowards. Number 14, Fire Emblem Gaiden. You know, it's kind of telling how much interesting stuff Gaiden has going for it that it manages to land this high on the list, despite the fact that it is an old school NES title that struggles with the old school NES problem of being incredibly slow and clunky. It's certainly not a game for everyone, but if you are willing to deal with some frustrations that come with the fact that it was an NES game, you are in for a pretty good time. The town exploration is a lot simpler than the remake Shadows of Valentia, but to my mind that is actually a good thing because I prefer to have the meat of my Fire Emblem gameplay be on the battlefield, not in the dungeon. And what you can do on the battlefield in Gaiden is quite interesting. And by interesting, I mean incredibly fucking broken. Infinite range isn't even the most busted thing that you're capable of doing. Falconites with javelins deal an effective 45 might against any monsters. If you give a unit the speed ring, they get +5 movement and a speed stat of 40. The mage ring gives you 5 range on all of your spells. There is some ridiculous shit in this game. One of my personal favorite strategies is to Awakening style Nos tank the early maps. Both Jenny and Silk have access to fairly early leather shields, and if you throw it on them, then the 60 hit rate from Nosferatu is not really that much of a hindrance for them, and they can just clear chapters on their own. This is incredibly funny, and definitely not the intention, but it's a way to approach the early game, and I'm going to do it every single time I come back to Gaiden. And I will continue to come back to Gaiden, even though there has been a remake. I know that for some people, the slow, clunky aspects of Gaiden will drive them away, but if you're willing to deal with that, I definitely don't think that Shadows of Valentia is a replacement for Gaiden. There's just a lot of cool tools that Gaiden has that Shadows of Valentia gets rid of, probably because of how broken they were. It's an easy game, but easy doesn't always mean bad. And if you want to play with incredibly broken units and incredibly broken items and incredibly broken everything, I mean, it's not the only Fire Emblem game that has stuff like that, but it is certainly one of them, and I would recommend you check it out. It's worth noting that I actually played Gaiden after I played Shadows of Valentia, so there's stuff in there for you even if you've already played SOV. It's not like a novelty thing, it is in my opinion, it has genuine merit to it. I should touch on the story a little bit as well. I plan on going further into this when talking about Shadows of Valentia, as that game does a lot more with the story than Gaiden does. But Gaiden's story is very ambitious for its time. Rather than just Marth's tale of going from place to place and conquering castles until it ultimately defeats the Dark Dragon, this is a story about the relationship between Alm and Celica. The two of them are going on separate journeys, but they do care about each other, and I like them as characters. Everyone else in the cast is kind of just like secondary or tertiary. The White Wings seem like they're just here to be a reference to the Arcanea games, but that's fine because I actually like the White Wings. I know that they appear in basically every game, but I'm not going to complain. They're fun. I like them. Bring back White Wings, even more games, please. The lack of forges and combat arts makes your choices on Gaiden's battlefield somewhat simpler than they are in Shadows of Valentia, but I still think it has some interesting moments, in particular the fact that Celica's side starts out with all magical units, so balancing that aspect of things, as well as dealing with how you want to send your villagers an alms route and whether or not you are willing to sacrifice them, because some of them kind of are stinky. But yeah, Gaiden is good. I wouldn't recommend it as like your first Fire Emblem game, but if you've been on the fence about it and this is the push you needed, go check out Gaiden. Maybe you'll walk away from it thinking that you don't like it, but you're not obligated to finish once you start it. If you're not having a good time, just put it down. And if you are having a good time, welcome to the Cult of Gaiden. Please remember to leave the comment, play Gaiden, in at least 5 YouTube videos per week. Alright, thank you, bye-bye. Number 13. Tokyo Mirage Session Sharp FE. This is another very weird one to rank because it's an entirely different genre than Fire Emblem. Ultimately, depending on the day, I could go up or down on this, but it's hard to compare an SRPG to a traditional turn-based RPG. TMS is fine. I really like its flashy combat system, and yeah, I played through the whole thing. I had fun. The Fire Emblem aspect of it feels more like references than it does like an actual Fire Emblem-y part of the gameplay, but if you are a fan of turn-based RPGs, not grid-based, but like standard RPGs, think your Final Fantasies or whatnot, it's an enjoyable spectacle RPG. The way that you like combine mirages and deal with like weapon triangles and stuff, it takes, I don't know, it was 5 years ago that I played this game. I remember having fun with it, but everything else was a blur. The spectacle is really nice though, and Kane riding a motorcycle is worth the price of entry on its own. The story's trash. I did not jive with the characters. All of them want to be like pop star sensation stuff, and it doesn't really do anything for me. I don't know. After I beat the final boss, which was Garnef, I actually put down the game without finding the resolution to the story, which is fine with me, and I feel like tells you everything you need to know about the story of this game and how I feel about it. I don't know, if you have been on the fence about TMS Sharp FE, check it out, but also if you don't like it, don't blame me, because it's not a Fire Emblem game. But it's an RPG, and, you know, I like RPGs. Do you like RPGs? Play it as an RPG. I don't fucking know. It's okay. You know? It's fine. It's nothing special. It's okay. It's okay. Animations are gorgeous, though. Kane gets a fucking motorcycle! Number 12. Fire Emblem 12. New Mystery of the Emblem. I feel like I've been overly negative when talking about these games that I love, and I preempt that because I'm not as high on FE12 as I feel like a lot of FE12 fans are. I have fun playing it to start out, but I always tend to fall off towards the end, and I don't really have the desire to play higher difficulties of it. A lot of that involves AI manipulation and just knowing the game better than I know it, and better than I kind of am willing to get to know it. I still get some enjoyment out of it. It has an absurdly large cast, so just picking random meme units to run around with is incredibly fun, and yes, Chris ruins the story or whatever, but I don't know, it's still a fun romp through Arcanea. But ultimately, I don't know. I feel like as a Fire Emblem player, FE12 is a game that you either love or you hate. You hate it because it's too hard and the maps have some infuriating design aspects, and the aforementioned wanting to know how to manipulate AI in order to do the efficient clears, especially of the prologue, or you love it for all of those same reasons, because it is an incredibly tight game. It's one that's not RNG reliant. It's one that requires an in-depth knowledge and is like very, hey, I'm going to LTC this, or I'm going to hardcore figure out the efficiency and manipulate the AI, and that the skill ceiling is extremely high for Fire Emblem 12. I mean, heck, it introduced Lunatic Reverse, which is, for all intents and purposes, a challenge run just baked into the vanilla Fire Emblem game. But I don't know. I don't feel like I come down on either side of it. I don't hate it like I know a lot of people do. But I also don't love it like I know a lot of people do. I play this game and I have a decent time, but there's also a little bit of a nag in the back of my head that I could be playing a different Fire Emblem. I could be playing a Fire Emblem that I enjoy more. Heck, I could even be playing Fire Emblem 11, which is a game that they do have similarities, but I enjoy more, as you can see, because that's not been listed on the list yet. I don't know, FE12 is a weird one for me to talk about because I don't have a ton of experience with it. The hardest that I've played is Hard 2, which, I mean, I guess that is still, it's a hard game. Even the lower difficulties, it's a hard game, and I like that to an extent, but I guess that's the thing. With the harder games, your play sessions ends up being shorter because you get mentally drained. Even just thinking about FE12 and getting mentally drained, I'm sure you can tell that this is a little bit more of an unhinged review of Fire Emblem 12 than I've been for basically any of the other games other than Tokyo Mirage Sessions, because, like, I don't have much to say about that game. But yeah, Fire Emblem 12 is a very draining and taxing game. I am glad for the people who love it. I feel like the people who love FE12 love FE12. Like, love FE12. Maybe even don't like other Fire Emblems, but love FE12. And I feel like a lot of people who like other Fire Emblems hate FE12. And I can see why. It's very polarizing. But I guess that makes it weird that I have it at C, because this isn't my, like, ranking in terms of the community. This is my own personal rankings, but I just sort of don't have especially strong feelings about it. I don't know. Am I wrong about how people feel about FE12? I guess comment and let me know, because I don't really have much else to say. I did an all-girls run of FE12. That was incredibly fun. General Norn, my beloved. The cast is a little bit too big, though. Am I right? Like, the cast is a little bit too big. Number 11, Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Oh boy, I'm going to upset some people with this one, aren't I? Not only do I have Revelations above Birthright, but I have Revelations above several other non-Fates games, including series beloved icons like Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. Yeah, no, the comment section is going to eat me alive for this, but let me try to justify it, okay? The Fates battle mechanic system is, in my opinion, one of the better ones. I really like the idea of altering between guard stance and pair-up stance. I like the fact that your guard stance is timed as opposed to specifically random. I like the various classes balance. I like the skill jumping in order to acquire skills and build units. And I like the fact that second sealing in order to acquire skills and build units doesn't reset their level in order to encourage endless grinding like Awakening does. I think it took a lot of aspects of Awakening and refined them to an area that is, to my mind, close to perfection. And, like, I am not the only one to state this. This is not an unpopular take about the Fates combat mechanics, but I do think that a lot of the love for this gets stapled to Conquest in particular. And I don't necessarily think that that is unfair. Conquest has by far the most tightly designed maps and the most tightly designed difficulty, but also, like, it's a hard game. Like, even on hard, Conquest is a hard game. I play a chapter of Conquest and I am drained and exhausted, and maybe I'm not even ready for the next chapter of Conquest. I know some people, Conquest just sort of like, they slip it on like a glove and they're able to just play through map after map after map, and like, that's awesome. But for me, Conquest is a very mentally taxing and exhausting game, and I love that, but also it is a sometimes treat. I cannot play conquest after conquest after conquest after conquest. And sometimes I am craving the midpoint between the simplicity of something like a GBA Fire Emblem and the complexity of something like Conquest. And that is where Revelations comes in, because it takes those Fate battle mechanics and it puts them in a game with, albeit worse map quality than Conquest. In some cases, significantly worse. The snow shoveling map and the second elevator map come to mind as some of the worst maps ever. But there's some maps that are fine. I wouldn't say any go to the lengths of like the standouts of Conquest. For example, Chapter 10 Conquest is one that is often praised, and for good reason. The Hinoka map is one that is often praised, and I would say, again, for good reason. The map where Charlotte and Benny join is often praised, and again, for good reason. I'm talking about Conquest a lot in the Rev playthrough. But I do think that Rev has maps that they're not as good as Conquest's best, but they're still enjoyable to play. They're not snow shovel level, and they're certainly not all snow shovel level. Like, yeah, a lot of them are gimmick maps. Like, there's the burn down the forest gimmick, there's the rotating bridges gimmick, but I don't think that a gimmick map is necessarily bad. Now, this may come off as me contradicting myself, because a lot of what I harped on for Fire Emblem 7 is its use of gimmick maps, but I think that the gimmicks that Fire Emblem 7 uses are either uninteresting or actively unfun, stuff like rain and snow or whatnot. Whereas some of the Rev maps are actively unfun in their gimmicks. Again, the elevator and snow shoveling maps are standouts. Some people hate some of the other ones. Pick a Path is a really annoying one. For if it's the first one after the route split, you have to basically you just run through hallways, and if you go the wrong way, oops, you get teleported back. It's really annoying and dumb. But some of the other ones are fine. Like, the early Fugas, yes, it is just a concept wholesale stolen from Conquest, but I do think the fact that you have access to fewer flyers adds its own spin on it. The Conquest map, by then, you've probably put a bunch of people into Wyvern-esque classes, whereas in Rev, you can at most have 4 people in flyers, and, like, 2 of those are going to be, like, a reclassed Sakura into Sky Knight or Tsubaki or reclassed Gunter, like, not ideal flyers by any means. So, like, yeah, it makes it more interesting because you can't just use flight to skip the wind. I do think that the unit balancing needs to be addressed because it is god-awful. But also, several other games in Fire Emblem have really unbalanced casts. Notably, FE6 has a terribly unbalanced cast, and I still think that that is a good game. Some units being significantly worse, just in every single way, than others is fine. It can make it interesting to be like, hey, Odin in Rev is god-awful. I'm gonna raise him to 2020. Or, you know, stuff like that. Like, the cast doesn't need to be balanced. It's fine. Shura and Nyx join on the same map, and Shura's a good unit, Nyx is a bad unit, but who fucking cares? Bad units should be allowed to exist. Yeah, is Rev as good as Conquest? No, absolutely not. There's a wide gap between them in quality. But is Rev as terrible as Birthright? No, absolutely not. Like, it actually engages the tactical aspect of my brain. Its lows are definitely lower than Birthright's lows, but its highs are better than Birthright's highs, because Birthright doesn't have any highs, because Birthright is a Ryoma solo. The story is dog shit, but I honestly prefer the Revelation story to the Birthright story, because, as I mentioned in the Birthright review, Birthright's story is bad and boring. Revelation's story is bad and, like, hilariously so. Like, it's so fucking stupid. We're just gonna jump off this cliff, we're gonna shake hands and jump off this cliff, and it's so fucking dumb. Revelation story is so fucking stupid. You can't say Vala out loud, you just get dragged down by the curse and, oh no, Scarlet died because a flower got pinned on her. It's so fucking stupid, but, like, in a good way. Like, it's so bad. I love it. Also, like, you get a lot of class freedom in this. If you want to do stupid builds, like, Birthright is the game to do stupid builds in. Do you like Kagura? Would you like to turn her into a maid? Fucking do it. Fucking do it. Turn whoever you want into whatever you want. Like, the world is your sandbox, and you can make some stupid stuff. Like, what's that? You want Ryoma and Xander to become boyfriends with each other? Sure, why not? Now they both have horses. Hell yeah. Astra on Xander. Just fucking do what... It's so... The comment section is going to be very upset at me because I have praised Revelations far more than Fire Emblem 12. Yeah, I'm a Rev defender. I don't think that it's like an A+ tier Fire Emblem game or whatever. It's very middling, but it's better than its reputation. It's like the bad one, quote unquote. No, Birthright is the bad one. Like, Birthright's terrible. Rev is fine. There's bad parts of Rev, but like most Fire Emblem games have some bad parts. And we just deal with them because these games are flawed and it's fine. Play Rev. Rev is fun. Holy fucking shit, I just went on an 8-minute rant about Fire Emblem Revelations. And, like, it was a positive rant. What is my life? Let's move on to the next one. Number 10. Fire Emblem 11 Shadow Dragon. Shadow Dragon is a weird game to be in my top 10 because, if I'm honest, it's not one that I think about as being one of my favorites. I mean, I guess it is top 10 in a game series that has 17 mainline titles, so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's one of my favorites, but it's still weird to see it up here. But I think this is probably where it belongs. Shadow Dragon has a lot of flaws, and it's easy to point to those flaws. The lack of support system in order to, like, flesh out the characters means the class feels really one-dimensional, and the class feels even more one-dimensional thanks to reclassing, which is handled in a way that is actually, I think, very interesting and fun to experiment with, but definitely off-putting when it comes to, like, growing attachment to these characters, right? Like, if anyone can be a Pegasus Knight, then Sheeta isn't really that special. Well, that's a bad example, because the Wing Spear makes Sheeta special, but Norn isn't special, because everyone can be an archer, you know, that sort of stuff. I think that it is a game that a lot of people criticize with the same things that they level at FE12, but I think they're very different games. I feel like FE12, while I do enjoy the difficulty, it's very draining and taxing, and FE11 almost has, I wouldn't even say the opposite problem, it has a benefit that is the opposite, in that aside from the first few chapters, because Hard 5 was not playtested, and even lower difficulties like Hard 2 and Hard 3, chapters 1 through 3 are pretty hard, but once you get past that hurdle, it really just goes down really quickly. It is a game that you can just pump out a playthrough of if you're just like in the mood for some Fire Emblem. You can just Shadow Dragon it up, you know, finish it in an afternoon or a weekend or whatnot, which is nice. It's a nice quality in a game. It doesn't really have the staying power that a lot of the other ones do, but it also isn't the same level of time commitment, and I like that, because sometimes I don't want to commit to a very long playthrough of 3 houses where I manage the monastery a bunch, or look at all the supports in Path of Radiance or whatnot. Sometimes I just want to knock out a Fire Emblem game over the weekend and be done with it. And Shadow Dragon delivers. Yeah, I also like the reclassing system. I don't think it should be evergreen. I'm glad it's not come back, but I think it's interesting in and of itself. And there's some cool stuff like the Ballisticians, and Zane is a cool unit, and yeah, Shadow Dragon's fun. It's fine. It's fun. Number 9, Fire Emblem 3 Houses. 3 Houses is a game that very recently moved up a significant amount in my estimation of it. I still have problems with it, but I think that I was a victim of, and a part of, the backlash against 3 Houses' flaws. It is a game whose flaws reveal themselves over time. The repetitive nature of the monastery can cause a lot of monastery burnout. The harder difficulty maddening mode can be a very frustrating experience for new players, especially new players to maddening. A lot of the classes and units feel homogenous in hard mode. In fact, the difficulty jump from hard to maddening is a big part of a big source of frustration for me. I wish there was something in between. I enjoy maddening, but sometimes I want to play 3 Houses and I don't want to have to think as much as I have to think about maddening. But I do appreciate the gameplay. I think that in the minute-to-minute, and this is probably going to be controversial, but in the minute-to-minute, I think overall I enjoy the battle system of Three Houses more than the battle system of Fates. I know it's Conquest slander. Conquest is a perfect game, and we can't say anything bad about it, but I really like the combat arts and gambits and figuring out people's battalions and what you want to give them and cycling through classes to get mastery and adjutants, and it's very fun, especially on maddening mode where the monastery turns into its own resource management game in terms of here's the units, here's their endgame classes I want to build them towards, how do I manage all of these resources and motivation and meals and gardening and tutoring Byleth because Byleth needs tutoring and get everyone to the point where they need to be while also focusing on people I want to recruit from out of house and who do I adjutant, and it's fun. I really enjoy it. That said, while I did just praise the sort of resource management aspect of the monastery, there are significant aspects of the monastery that can fuck right off. Even though I prefer the minute-to-minute on the battlefield gameplay of Three Houses to basically any Fire Emblem system, it is dragged down by the fact that in between every chapter is a bunch of frustration in monastery fishing tasks, in abusing or not even abusing, but just like making use of things like gardening and arena. And if you want to get through the arena, not only is it really time consuming, but if you care about the professor rank and you need to like reset for a winning arena because the way that the arena is handled is also frustrating, and that like you get 4 rounds and then it's a loss. It's really weird and dumb. Running around to pick up lost items in order to feed them to people can be obnoxious. There is a lot in between the good parts of Three Houses that is extremely frustrating and makes it so that repeat playthroughs of Three Houses feel best when spaced apart from each other. I think that, like, my initial experience with Three Houses, where I did all 4 routes, and then Maddening came out, and so I did that, and I did so many playthroughs back to back to back that I just got huge levels of monastery burnout. And it dropped down, a year, not even a year, like 3 or 4 months ago, I would have listed Fire Emblem Three Houses as one of my least favorite Fire Emblem games. Probably my least favorite Fire Emblem game overall. And I feel like that was a huge overcorrection on my part. I've been very negative about this game in the past, and I think it's undeserved. I do think that the story... I've been negative about the story as well, and I do think that the story is a lot worse than people say it is. Sort of the juxtaposition of Three Houses is like complex political story to all the other Fire Emblem games where it's just simplistic or whatever, I think is an unearned reputation. It swings higher, but it misses really hard. That said, there's individual moments in Three Houses that really, really work for me. A lot of the character interactions are really well done. I love this cast. It's got a bunch of lovable characters. It's not the only one. And it's not my favorite cast in Fire Emblem. There's a couple of casts that I like better, and we'll be getting to them. But it is up there. It's up there with my favorite casts of Fire Emblem. And a lot of it comes with their like interactions with each other. Everything around Glenn really, really works for me. As much as I like to meme about he died like a true knight, all of that is just like, it's so good. I do think they pulled the trauma card a little bit too often. On the one hand, like, Fodlan is a dark world, and it's understandable that everyone has different trauma, and a lot of people have different types of trauma. But on the other hand, I feel like it's sort of... I don't know, it feels... everyone has, like, shitty, abusive parents that results in a weird anime quirk. And it just becomes like, oh, you're quirky. I guess you must also have a traumatic backstory. Let's see what it is and dive into your thing. And I don't know. It's a little bit. It's a little bit. There's too much. There's too much. But yeah, the moment-to-moment gameplay and the cast and like the support dumps are annoying to have to sit through a bunch of supports in a row. But like they're good supports. They're well written. They're well voiced. Yeah, I like Three Houses. I like Three Houses. I might even be, like, even now, I might be ranking a little low, but I don't know, everything above it are, like, 10 out of 10 games for me. Well, not 10 out of 10, but, like, they're everything above Three Houses is, like, peak Fire Emblem. Peak Fire Emblem. But Three Houses is also, at times, peak Fire Emblem. So I don't know. I could see it moving up as I spend more time with it, but I could also see it moving down if I spend too much time with it, because it does have that sort of like draining monastery burnout. So yeah, right now it's number 9. You know, it made top 10. Congratulations, very good of you, Three Houses. If there were no monastery, easily top 5. There's a mod that removes the monastery. Probably going to use that, and easily top 5 in that instance. Easily. But unfortunately, gotta judge the games as they are shipped, and there's just so much nonsense that drags down the great parts of Three Houses that, I don't know, I don't think I can say it is in my top 5 personally. I just dislike the monastery too much. Number 8, Fire Emblem 5, Thracia 776. That's right, I am a fake gamer. Thracia didn't crack my top 5. Go ahead and leave a hate speech in the comments. Fake Fire Emblem fan. But yeah, I love Thracia. The problem is, I don't know how much I actually love Thracia. Thracia has a lot of very cool mechanics. Capture is really interesting. I like the follow-up critical stuff, like the pursuit critical stuff. The skills in Thracia are, you know, they're not to the same level of like skill emblem stuff like Fates and Awakening, but they are more than just Sacred Stones where you get like 3 skills overall and one of them is impactful. It's that nice middle ground that I like. Fire Emblem 4 has that, Tellius has that, and Thracia has that. The cast is really fun, and the story of Thracia is probably one of my favorite Fire Emblem stories. I was going to say probably my favorite, but I do think that I prefer another game we haven't gotten to. But it's up there. It's probably my second favorite Fire Emblem story overall. I just really like it as a, you really feel like the underdog, both in the narrative and in the gameplay. It like lines up really well. And Leaf is punished for his mistakes, which is a trait that modern Fire Emblem is not brave enough to do, and old school Fire Emblem was rarely brave enough to do. In Genealogy, Sigurd made some mistakes and got punished for them, but that was a less important part of the plot, whereas like Leaf is the main lord for the entire game, and he fucks up on multiple occasions, and there's costs associated with these fuck-ups, including one, like, really, really severe cost that even affects gameplay. So I think that's cool, and I wish Fire Emblem would be willing to have flawed main characters instead of looking directly at the screen and saying, you are the Fire Emblem. But let's talk about a good game. Well, I mean, they're both good games. But let's talk about the game we're talking about right now, Thracia. And yeah, Thracia, the biggest problem I have with Thracia is that I feel like I like it most in theory rather than in practice. Every time I sit down and think about starting a new playthrough of Thracia because of all of the things that I love about it, I just don't. And I don't really know what causes that, and maybe it's unfair for me to penalize it for something that like I don't really get, but it's my list, it's opinion-based, and Thracia is a game that I love a lot of aspects of, but I don't like the playing of. I don't know why. I don't know what causes that. Well, I like the playing of it decent enough. It wouldn't be up here if I liked the playing of it, if I disliked the playing of it, rather. But, I don't know. It's a game that works much better for me in theory, and that I love aspects of, much more than I love actually getting into the nitty-gritty and playing with. Which is weird. Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know what else to say about it. I will say this. Its reputation as, like, the hardest Fire Emblem game is completely unearned. There are many modern Fire Emblem games that are harder than Thracia. I don't even think that Blind Thracia is harder than modern Fire Emblem games. play Thracia blind. If you are willing to miss stuff, which you should, like, be okay with missing things on blind playthroughs. Play Thracia blind. You will miss some stuff, but, like, people exaggerate how much you will miss. There's, like, 2 very, very important characters, right? And one of them, they're in Gaidens that are optional chapters that you get. Like, you get Gaidens through doing weird objectives, right? One of the characters, the 2 most important characters, one of them you get from a Gaiden that you access by visiting all the villages. I know that's such an obscure requirement. No one's ever going to visit all the villages. So many new blind players are going to miss that Gaiden. And the other one you get from saving all the green units. I know, such an absurd requirement. No blind player is ever going to save all the green units in a chapter. Yeah, so, like, I mean, the other ones are much more obscure, like capture a specific person and don't release them, stuff like that. Visit X many houses that are not item houses. But the 2, like, big characters are the easiest fucking guidance in the world to get. And some of the other ones are, like, also very easy. I wouldn't say easy. Easy is the wrong word. They're less cryptic guidance to get. You know, saving X green units or visiting X villages, like, that's stuff that every Fire Emblem player is going to do anyway. I don't know. Play Thracia blind. Number 7, Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. In a similar vein to Thracia, SOV is a game that I feel like I like more in practice than in the actual gameplay of it, which is really weird because I'm willing to sit through all of the NES jank in order to deal with Gaiden, but SOV, which is a game that is in many ways like the same game but improved, I'm just not willing to sit through. I don't really know what that is. But yeah, SOV takes a Gaiden and modernizes it. Like I said in the Gaiden review, I don't think that it invalidates Gaiden, but it does add a bunch of things and more complexity. I mean, it adds a hard mode difficulty, so that's, you know, already a benefit, because as much as, like, Gaiden is still fun, it's not exactly a hard game. So adding a hard mode is nice. Turn wheel is the most controversial thing that it added, but I personally think it's a plus. If you don't like it, just don't use it. There is something to be said about how turn wheel impacts the design philosophy of future Fire Emblems, but that was a big issue in Three Houses. I do not think it was as big of an issue in Engage. There's not really, like, gotcha ambush spawn moments for the turn wheel. So I think that, you know, like, if it weren't for the fact that Engage was out, I would be much more negative on how turn wheel has impacted game design. But I think they've shown that, like, that was a Three Houses problem, not a all Fire Emblem post turn wheel problem. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt for now. But yeah, turn wheel's nice, just to not have to replay the entire chapter, and if you don't like it, you can just not use it and just reset. Like, I don't know, it's nice. I like the combat arts. They function differently than they do in Three Houses, but they're interesting, you know, having to learn them by mastering weapons and then being able to use them, and they cost HP and whatnot. It's fun. It's a neat little twist. Pitchforks are another thing where I'm glad that they're in there. I usually don't use them, but they're, you know, it's nice to have. And yeah, it's, other than that, it's kind of just like faster Fates with a touched up story. And I do want to talk about the story because I don't think the story is a strict improvement. I think that the story, it definitely improves some things, but I also think that it adds things that are subtractive. So I guess that's not really add. Well, it puts new things in that I don't like, that I feel like take away from the story of Gaiden. The first thing is, like, it dials the sexism up to 11. I know this is a very common criticism of Shadows of Valentia, but, like, that doesn't make it not true. Every female is either damseled or obsessed with a man, or both. It's kind of obnoxious. I guess Palak and Katria are immune to that, but then you get, like, the whole, them love over Cain. It's the Cain and Abel, Palak, Katria-esque, like, love triangle stuff is, weird and jumps from game to game. But it rears its ugly head here, so that's super fun. the various shots of women in the jail cells and whatnot, the addition of Conrad just so that Celica, like, God forbid a woman actually have any fucking agency in the story. It's just a pile of frustrations. But the thing that sticks out to me more, and that I don't hear as many people talk about, I know some people talk about it, but so they added a sort of like sub-theme on Alm's side about the idea of like the common man versus the noble. They've got like Fernand and Clive's like differing views on whether it should just be the nobility in the resistance or whether they should allow the common man, like the leader and whatnot. And the idea is it adds a sort of theme of, rather than the inherent merits of nobility and class and stuff, a hero can come from anywhere and like the bloodline doesn't actually matter. But then instead, like, surprise, it turns out Alm is royalty anyway, and it just like completely undercuts that theme. And it's just really weird. It sticks out as like, okay, well, you were building towards this one theme, but then you introduced a thing that is counter to it. And it doesn't make the story bad by any means. Like, it's still a serviceable story, and I get that, like, Alm was royalty in Gaiden, but they could have just made him not royalty. Like, they changed plenty else about the story. It's not like they were honor bound to maintain Alm as royalty. And it's not even like the plan that Mycen and Alm's dad, or grandpa, had would have actually, like, changed. You could have just had Alm actually be Mycen's grandson, but, like, they still have that plan together. And as for the Royal Sword, like, that would then reinforce the theming. If Alm was able to wield it despite not having any royal blood, then, like, hey, the relic itself is saying, like, hey, actually, no, it's not royalty that allowed people to wield me, it's worthiness, and Alm is worthy regardless of the fact that he came from common blood. So, like, I don't know, it's a little bit weird to me that they went out of their way to add that theming that wasn't in the initial Gaiden, but then didn't change the one detail that counteracts it, that, like, contradicts it. Again, doesn't make it bad. I still enjoy the story, but I do think it is a major weakness that it builds up a theme and then contradicts itself. And I think it deserves criticism for that. But yeah, it's a good game. I enjoy it, and it's a very, very well-told story. And the voice acting is phenomenal. I love that. Number 6, Fire Emblem Engage. I absolutely love Engage. The break mechanics are awesome. The various powers added by the rings are incredibly fun. The difficulty is just chef's kiss. It is hard enough to keep me engaged, for lack of a better word, but it's not to the level of Three Houses Maddening or Conquest's Maddening or even Conquest Hard, where I feel exhausted after a few maps. There are definitely some standouts. Chapter 17 and 22 and 23 are big roadblocks on the highest difficulty Maddening. But there's other maps that I find to be difficult. Chapter 10 is another big one. That they can be a little bit draining, but even then, like, you have so many tools to make use of, and finding the best way to make use of these tools. You know, when am I going to activate my Dragon Veins? When am I going to freeze this enemy? And am I going to use an emblem to do it, or am I going to use a staff to do it? How are you going to use your emblem attacks? Who's going to engage when? It's very satisfying to make use of all of that stuff, and I love it. The story is... I'm a little bit of an Engaged story defender. I think that it is unduly criticized as... Like, it's got a bunch of fucking third act nonsense that I absolutely hate. But I think everything up until about chapter 22 is fine. It is a serviceable treasure hunt story that keeps me invested, and the cast is fun. I love being around them. I think that they have that quote-unquote hidden depth in their supports that I'm looking for. It's not to the extent of something like Three Houses, but on the flip side, you don't have to spend 30 minutes when you unlock all the B supports, so it kind of evens out in the end. I would say I probably like the Three Houses cast and Engage cast about the same as each other. And that's high praise, considering that, like, I'm not low on the Three Houses cast, and they're extremely popular. This is me praising the Engage cast, not lowering the Three Houses cast. That said, Engage is a game that struggles with repeat playthroughs in terms of, revealing the cracks. It's a similar issue to Three Houses in that as you go through it multiple times, you start to see the issues that arise. At one point, I thought this was the hardest Fire Emblem out there, or at least like on the same level as something like Conquest. But it's not. It's not. It's a very player-face focused game. And there are a lot of really cool interactions between the various tools and whatnot, but at the end of the day, it ends up, you have more than enough tools to tackle every challenge the highest difficulty is going to throw at you. Especially if you use the DLC, but even without the DLC, I actually prefer playing without the DLC and without the well. I think that the economy is much more balanced around that, but you get a lot of stuff. You get a lot of tools, and if you're making use of them appropriately, it is still, like, it's not a cakewalk. Even hard mode's not a cakewalk. But it is not the bastion of difficulty that it appears to be on an initial playthrough, because it's just got a lot more complicated systems. I wouldn't even necessarily say complicated systems is the right word. It's got a lot of tools that, on a passing glance, do not appear to be as useful as they actually are. Things like Bondage Shield, things like very specific forge engravings, things like reclassing units into specific classes that aren't necessarily the ones that they start in or the ones that their line gets pointed towards. You get a lot of tools available to you. And I think the fact that a lot of the strongest stuff is not as obvious, coupled with the fact that there's a lot of bait in Engage. Like, there's a lot of things that seem a lot stronger than they actually are, even ignoring any sort of cost in terms of, like, resources you pour into them. Stuff like Brave Assist heroes, they seem a lot stronger than they actually are. Things like the ability to get pincer attack on a slow but strong unit seems a lot stronger than it actually is. Things that at passing glance seem really powerful often end up not being so, and things that you overlook a little bit end up being, like, incredibly powerful. And I know that for me, but I also think for a lot of other people, that caused the sort of, like, learning curve to be a lot slower, which made the game feel harder than it meaningfully actually is. I do also think, like, the story going completely off the fucking deep end does need to be mentioned, because, like, I do not know what the writers were smoking. It was competent. I wouldn't even say it was exceptional, but it was competent for the most part. And then we get into the third act, and I've heard some people say that the third act is where it gets good. The third act is where it gets bad, and, like, arguably worse than Fates, but also not as, like, interesting to laugh at. Stuff like the fucking Emblem of Foundations is an easy one to point to, but even, like, every single villain getting an unearned redemption arc, and then the time crystal, and, like, I don't hate time travel, but I do think the way that they handled the time crystal was, like, really weird. I don't know, it just, there's a bunch of stuff that it's just, like, it's convoluted, and I don't care for it. I miss when the story was just a lovely little treasure hunt, collect the 5 relics, or 12 relics rather, do that thing. I do also think Engage is in a weird spot because it did come out so recently. So I might be rating it a little bit more highly than I would later, just because of new toy syndrome. At one point, I thought it was my favorite, but it has sort of, like, settled to this area where it's still, to my mind, a top tier Fire Emblem, but it just barely misses hitting the top 5. And I think that's fine. I think that's probably where it belongs, especially because some of the choices in here are nostalgia influenced. I'll wear that on my sleeve. This is an opinionated list, and nostalgia is being factored. But let's move on to a game that is not nostalgia influenced. Number 5, Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. I really like the GPA system. It's incredibly simple, but the two good games in it give me different ends of the spectrum of what I want from it. Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade, gives me the insane difficulty that I sometimes crave. It's not to the level of like some of the modern games with maddening modes and stuff, but Binding Blade Hard Mode is hard, as the name would suggest. It has a very, very brutal early game, and then the mid to late game can be difficult depending on your team composition. This game also has an incredibly large cast, which makes it perfect for drafts, and I absolutely love drafting Binding Blade because the cast is so wildly unbalanced. There's not a single unit who is like overly centralizing. There's no Seth or Titania or Ryoma or stuff like that. But instead, it is the way that I would describe it. There's a table held up by 4 legs, and that would be Marcus, Rutger, Milady, Percival. Some people would argue that Shin is also sort of like the 5th leg, or maybe deserves to replace. I've heard people say that he deserves to replace Percival. I feel like that's someone who hasn't looked at Percival's stat screen. And I've heard people say that he needs to replace Marcus, but like Marcus is your early game. I guess I could see an argument for Rutger, but I have Wyvern favoritism, so I'd never accept an argument for Milady. But honestly, I think Shin as just like a 5th leg who's also important is potentially the better take than like replacing one of those as the top 4, because they do feel pretty fundamentally like the core 4. But then you've also got, on the other end of things, dregs like Wendy and Sophia and my beloved Boars, and dragging them through the entirety of this not unchallenging game is also incredibly satisfying. Like, it is one thing to be like, oh hey, I soloed Fire Emblem 4 with Arden, because like Fire Emblem 4 isn't an especially hard game. But being able to be like, hey, I dragged Boars along to kill the endgame boss, that's a fucking accomplishment. One that I've done, by the way. But I love that shit. I love Boars. I love my bad units. I love the middling units. I love the units who, you know, they're not exceptional, but they're also not terrible. You know, you've got your Gonzalez's who give him a hero crest, and then he turns into a Zerker, and he's incredibly fun to use. Cecilia, bad introduction, but like she's a mounted staffer. She can restore in physic. Like, she's never going to be your warper, but honestly, neither is Clarine, no matter how much you train her. I love the fact that they're like, hey, you know, Rutger's an incredibly good unit. What if we gave you Fur, who's just like Rutger, but you need to train her a lot later? It's like, okay, but then you're like, oh, well, actually, I don't need a second Rutger. Like, Rutger's amazing, but Rutger number 2 is actually not necessary to me. But that does, in turn, make it kind of Iron Man friendly in a weird way. Of like, you get these units who are just functionally replacement units. You get units who are just supposed to be on your team for a little bit. Like, Klein shows up, and you're like, oh, this guy's actually pretty cracked. And then he's not. Like, he is, but then he's not after a few chapters. And you're like, oh, well, that sucks. Well, that's okay, here's a grin. It's a game that just is constantly handing you people to rotate your roster out. And then simultaneously handing you people to just like insta-bench. They're just like, ugh, what is this Sophia doing here? Like, fuck this Sophia. Or you do, well, actually, what is this Sophia doing here? She's using Apocalypse to kill the final boss, motherfucker. It's so satisfying. It's so satisfying. Obviously, it is not without its faults. Ambush spawns are the big one. I do not know why Fire Emblem still releases games with ambush spawns, but I do think any game with ambush spawns is just worse than a game without them. It's frustrating. I don't like the ambush spawns in Binding Blade. It has some of the most obnoxious Fog of War in Fire Emblem. I feel like IS loves to use Fog of War to hide gotchas. There's quite a few maps where there are wyverns outside of the Fog of War farther than you can see with Thief Vision, and they will start moving towards you and put you in a position where you get janked by a wyvern you could never have seen. There's siege tomes out of range that Intelligence Systems loves just like sprinkling in there, like, hey, you're getting peppered by a siege tome, or you don't know where it's coming from though, like, just good luck. Yeah, so there's obnoxious parts. All of the Gaidens are trash. Like, those are the worst maps. The sinking water map, boo. Break a bunch of walls map, boo. Like, who invited you? Nobody wants you here. But I think that overall, the positives, greatly outweigh the negatives in the Binding Blade. And then, yeah, I love it. I love it. I love the Binding Blade. I'm doing a playthrough right now of like a modified version. But I adore this game. Number 4, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn is a really tough game to rank because there's a lot of aspects that I love about it. Like, if it weren't for the negatives, it would probably be my favorite game, and by far. But the negatives in Radiant Dawn are, yeah, they're pretty severe. Part 4 is where the quality of this game sort of goes off a cliff. You've got 5 incredibly boring and tedious route maps in a row that seem to just have endless reinforcement spam. It's obviously not endless, but it is so darn close that it's just life-draining to go through a single one of them, let alone 5 in a row. Additionally, the story is just... it's frustrating. I really like the story that was set up in parts 1, 2, and 3 of Radiant Dawn. It was sort of presented as like this complex political intrigue story about the people who were the bad guys last time sort of getting subjugated by the fact that they had been conquered, and investigating the ways in which like the various systems of the Begnion nobility were oppressing basically all different groups of people. It ends up pitting 2 of these oppressed groups against each other in commentary that is actually pretty fucking raw for a game that came out on the Nintendo Wii. Like, obviously it's flawed. I'm not going to claim that this is the most racially progressive piece of media in existence, but flawed media can still be good, and this media, despite its flaws, is incredibly great. I love the story and the conflicts they set up and the various intrigue and villains and stuff, and I was really invested to see how these sides that are both, to an extent, sympathetic are going to end up working together, because they're kind of in a situation where they're pitted against each other, albeit fairly against their will. Like, I know everyone shits on the blood contract, but I actually think Peleus's blood contract makes a lot of sense as a tool of the story. They had to have some reason for Micaiah to be fighting against Ike's group, and I don't think it would have worked if they decided to just make her outright racist. Instead, they have her fighting on the wrong side, but she recognizes that she's fighting on the wrong side, and it's because the entire country is basically being held hostage. And while I don't think that justifies her actions, I do think it makes her a very interesting character, and I honestly can't say that, like, I mean, if you were in a fantasy situation where you had to do evil thing or else everyone you care about would die, can you honestly say you wouldn't do evil thing? Like, I don't know. Sure, it's like a silly fantasy thing, but it's better than if they were just like, hey, you control a bunch of racists, have fun with that. No, like, it makes Micaiah an interesting character, and I think it fits Peleus as well that he would be so easily duped into signing the blood contract. He is a new king and has no experience in the, like, nobility realm and all that stuff, so of course it's very easy for him to get tricked. It's not the only time in the plot he gets tricked either. Like, Izuka tricks him so that he can take advantage of the Laguz in order to run his dirty experiments, and it's very clear that he wants Peleus to be a puppet king, and yes, like, he doesn't succeed in this, and Peleus sort of like finds him out and casts him out and all that stuff, but it doesn't mean that Peleus, like, he clearly hasn't learned his lesson. He's still fairly naive, and I also don't think that's unrealistic. Like, I don't know, I like it. What I don't like is that the resolution to this conflict that they set up is just a literal Deus Ex Machina. Like, hello, here's God. She is now a bigger enemy than everyone. She's going to petrify the entire world, and instead of coming to, like, a creative and fun and interesting resolution to this conflict that we've set up, yeah, no, just the blood contract doesn't matter anymore in Part 4. The consequences can't happen, and if you kill Ashera, then the blood contract doesn't happen. It's stupid. It's very frustrating that they did that. And so the fact that the story and gameplay take a nosedive at the same time adds to my frustration to make Radiant Dawn the game that I have most frequently abandoned playthroughs partway through. That said, I absolutely fucking love the Teleus cast. While they are definitely less fleshed out in Radiant Dawn than they are in Path of Radiance, this is by far my favorite cast of characters. I do consider the casts from both games to basically be one, just because that's like, you know, most of the people in Radiant Dawn are from Path of Radiance, and the new characters introduced, like, some of them are interesting, some of them are boring, but not enough to drag down the initial FE9 cast. Like, Jill is my favorite character in all of Fire Emblem, and probably one of my favorite units as well, if we're being honest. Ike is my favorite lord. Rolf is an incredibly fun unit and character to use. Like, I love the brothers' relationship, even though I kind of have a hate boner against Oscar. Like, these people, they're so lovable. I love spending time with them, and Radiant Dawn just gave me more time to spend with characters that I spent way too much time with in my childhood. Yes, there is definitely some amount of nostalgia influencing this ranking, although Radiant Dawn was a game that I played surprisingly late in my Fire Emblem journey. Even though Path of Radiance was my first game, I didn't move on to Radiant Dawn until, I think, after college. I definitely purchased it in college. I actually remember being like, oh my god, it's $60? That is way too expensive for a game this old, because it was, old by then. I expected old games to be like $30 or $40, and well, now it's worth way more than that, so I feel great about the fact that I only spent $60 on Radiant Dawn. But yeah, as for the gameplay itself, I do also love the idea of jumping between armies. It does make replays going forward a little bit a lot of chapters just end up being homogenous, just because, in part 2 you've got the same units for every single chapter. In part 1 and part 3 you can make some amount of choice, but it's not really to the extent that you would expect in another Fire Emblem game, just because of the way the cast is divided. But it is still a fun game to play, even if your playthroughs are going to look similar. It is, in my opinion, on the harder end of Fire Emblems, and it sort of hits that sweet spot for me, where it's hard enough that I'm having a tough time with the maps, but it's not so hard that I feel exhausted by them as I do at the end of something like Conquest. It's obviously, subjective, but for me, that is the perfection of difficulty, and I'm here for it. I'm all here for it. I also just really like a lot of the mechanics that they have. The Laguz gauges are interesting. The way that Radiant Dawn does skills is, to me, a very interesting skill system. I'm not sure if it's my favorite. I like the fact that Fire Emblem continues to experiment with different skill systems, but Radiant Dawn's is definitely up there for me with the gauges and moving skills between people and stuff. I kind of like that. The managing gold and items in your different armies and who you're going to send them with, like Marcia and Ileana getting that extra utility of bringing items between armies. As well as Braum and Nephany to an extent as well. Rescue and Kanto, this was sort of the last hurrah of Rescue and Kanto, and the mechanic that I most want them to bring back, Ledges, is incredibly fun and can make some of the maps more interesting than they would be if there weren't ledges. So yeah, bring back Ledges, you fucking cowards. Also, make Ike and Hector kiss, you fucking cowards. Overall, I am incredibly high on Radiant Dawn. The Part 4 performance definitely drags it down, but it is kind of a testament to how much I love Parts 1 through 3, and even the Tower, which I do consider somewhat separate from Part 4, is not as bad as the regular Part 4, but Part 4 is so bad that it drags it down from probably what would be my number 1 slot otherwise. Number 3, Fire Emblem Fates Conquest. At the risk of having my #gamer card taken away, Conquest is not my favorite Fire Emblem. Don't get me wrong, it's a really good game and I love playing it. The way that the systems interact with each other, given guard gauge and skills and pair up and all of that stuff, is at its peak when applied to extremely tightly designed maps. I don't need to be the 10 millionth person to praise Conquest Chapter 10, but I probably will be anyway because it's a phenomenally designed map. It's not the only one. Conquest presents a number of really interesting challenges, and while not all of them work for me personally, I do think the majority of them do, and most of the stinkers are fairly inoffensive. You've got an insane amount of unit customization, while at the same time units stand out as being distinct from each other thanks to the way that the class system works. It's not quite as distinct as the Awakening unit, since you can just hand a bunch of people classes through marriage, but it is still a step above things like Three Houses and Engage, where everyone can be just about everything. The story, as is the case with all of the Fates games, is kind of ridiculous, and while it's not on the same levels that Revelations is, it's still absurd enough that I can point and laugh at various parts of it, and that's kind of what I'm looking for in a bad story. But yeah, I don't have too much else to say about Conquest that other people haven't. Other than, I guess, admitting that I am a shameful casual has never actually beaten the game on Lunatic. Tragic, I know, but I mean, my brain isn't being good at Fire Emblem anyway. Hard mode offers me plenty enough challenge, and one of these days I will tackle it at the highest difficulty, but I'm not quite ready for that yet. Number 2, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. I will be the first one to admit that a large part of this game's ranking is the nostalgia factor, but I mean, I can't help the fact that I love the game that brought me into the Fire Emblem series, and Path of Radiance doesn't just have that going for it. While there are plenty of things to criticize, such as the slow combat animations and the inability to completely turn them off, or the rather low quality of enemies on hard mode, but the frustrating amount of enemy spam on maddening mode, at the end of the day, I still have fun playing this lovely, lovely game. Part of that is because of nostalgia, part of that is because of how much I love the characters, and part of that is because I can find a game enjoyable without necessarily finding it super difficult. While I criticized Birthright for its lack of difficulty, a large part of that was because the maps were just ultimately solved by one unit, and they're all route maps, so they just take a long time. And, I mean, yeah, a lot of those criticisms also fall on Path of Radiance. They take a long time because of the animations, and your paladins, or Marcia and Jill, can just delete a bunch of enemies, especially once you have the Delphi Shield, or Full Guard, or whatever the fuck it's called. It's called different things in different games. But yeah, I still really like it. I love the various characters, I love the various classes. Kanto is always fun, and even though the Lagoos are definitely worse than the Bjork, they are more fun to use in my opinion. Managing gauge stuff and just having a tiger maul an enemy soldier will never stop being just viscerally satisfying to me. Rolf is a terrible unit, but I always train him in my playthroughs because it's fun to do so. I fucking love Rolf. Jill, as previously mentioned, is my favorite character in all of Fire Emblem, and a lot of that has to do with her presentation and her arc in Path of Radiance. Taking this character who was raised in a hyper-racist environment and indoctrinated from a young age, and having her realize that, like, the racism that she had internalized is not good, it's not accurate, it's, like, questions her entire worldview, shatters it around her, and has her realize, oh shit, we're the baddies. But like in a way that doesn't, I made it sound really, really simple. It's not. It's well written. Like, it is actually handled really well, and I love that. And while, like Radiant Dawn, there are definitely some things to criticize about Path of Radiance's story, it's personally my favorite of the Fire Emblem stories, because, like, it is a self-contained and fully resolves everything important in and of itself. There's a couple of cliffhangers, sort of like dangling threads for Radiant Dawn, but I feel the idea that, like, major questions are not resolved if you don't play Radiant Dawn is not entirely accurate. You don't find out the Black Knight's identity in Path of Radiance, but other than that, everything that isn't answered is just sort of like stuff on the peripheral that isn't important to the main story of Path of Radiance, which is about Ike and Elincia and the war between Dane and Crimea, as well as the relations between the Lagoos and Bjork. And, like, the relations between Lagoos and Bjork gets built on in Radiant Dawn, but if there had never been a sequel to Path of Radiance, I do think that the strained relationships between the two races would have been adequately resolved in just Path of Radiance's story. And much like I did with Radiant Dawn, I do also feel the need to praise Path of Radiance for doing a story about racism. And again, like, it's not perfect. There's the existence of DevDon/DanVed, which is icky, and the whole, like, animals as the oppressed minority also doesn't really super fly, but those aspects don't discredit the progressive and fairly nuanced aspects of the story about racism that takes main stage. And, like, it is fair to criticize Path of Radiance's handling of racism, but that also doesn't mean that there's not good parts, and I don't think the two cancel each other out. I love this game, I love the story. The gameplay is, while not the most complicated out there, just really, really satisfying for me. It's Fire Emblem comfort food. And while I am definitely bothered by animations on enemy phase takes forever, go make yourself a sandwich, it's not enough to hold it back, because this game has a very special place in my heart. I love it, I love the characters, I love the gameplay, I adore the story. This is great. This is great. I love it. I don't really have much to say. It's funny, I don't have a ton to say about the games that are my favorites, because a lot of it is just feeling, you know? But Path of Radiance is great. If you haven't played Path of Radiance and you have the ability to do so, definitely recommend it. Super, super expensive right now, so, you know, not exactly easy to get a hold of a copy, but I love Path of Radiance. And if you've been keeping track at home, it'll come as no surprise that the number 1 spot goes to Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones. I debated and flip-flopped back and forth between the Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance for the longest time, and ultimately I decided to give Sacred Stones the edge simply because it is a game that I enjoy as much as I do that is not held up by nostalgia. That's not obviously the only benefit that Sacred Stones has over Path of Radiance. They're both incredibly fun comfort food, but Sacred Stones is something that I can knock out in a weekend, whereas Path of Radiance is going to take a lot more time. I'm not as big a fan of the cast of Sacred Stones in general, but there is definitely some standouts. I love Erica, I love Ross, I love Garrick, I love Dusel, and honestly, Archer might just be my favorite mage in the entire series. This is another easy one, but as I said, difficulty does not equal quality, and Sacred Stones is it's a charming game to play. If I want a relaxing experience in Fire Emblem, throwing on my Game Boy Advance and plugging in Sacred Stones it's a surefire way to do it. Another benefit of Sacred Stones' easy difficulty is it allows me to do more fun sort of challenge runs or modifications that might not be as doable in other more difficult games. For example, I did a draft Iron Man with a couple of my friends, and I can't think of too many other games where splitting the cast into a third would lead to a successful Iron Man for the members involved. I'm doing the free play LTC, which is an incredibly fun way to approach these chapters that I'm fairly familiar with, and I know that there are other ways to crank up the difficulty, such as increasing enemy growths, or another challenge I've got up my sleeve that I'm hoping to premiere sometime soon. But even if you're not trying to pump up the challenge in Sacred Stones, just modifying the game and adding things like turning everyone into an archer or whatnot can make for a wonderful experience and a way to recapture the wonder that was my first time going through the journey that Erica and Ephraim went on. And while Sacred Stones doesn't have the complexity of the plot of Path of Radiance, I do really appreciate what is there. The relationship between Erica, Ephraim, and Lyon is really interesting, and I appreciate seeing it both from the perspective of Erica route and Ephraim route, as far as how Lyon and the Demon King sort of manipulate the different character flaws of the two twins. The world is also really interesting, and I would love for us to go back, perhaps in an Awakening-esque manner, where it's been thousands of years, and we see how everything has, like, moved on and become, like, all brand new, similar to we did in Awakening. And while in many ways the monsters of Sacred Stones are kind of just stand-ins for regular enemies, like the skeletons are just soldiers, the gargoyles are wyverns, etc., they're still incredibly fun to have. They don't have to be their own distinct identity. Honestly, I would prefer it if they kind of were, but it's still nice to have monsters, and it was my first experience with them. Yes, Gaiden and Three Houses and even Engage does monsters better in my opinion, but I don't know, it's my list, and the fact that Sacred Stones is the first game that had monster enemies that I played was incredibly fun. Actually, fun story about that, the first game I played was Path of Radiance, so you got to control the Lagoos, right? So I assumed when I played Sacred Stones that eventually we were gonna run into, like, a good monster and we would get control of an eyeball or something. I was really disappointed when that didn't happen, because, like, I thought, oh, well, maybe, because I went Erica route to start out, and I was like, oh, well, maybe you only get it on Ephraim route. So then when I went Ephraim route and didn't get one, I was really disappointed. But yeah, that's my list. I'm gonna go ahead and throw an image of the tier list, or the ordering or whatever, up on screen so y'all can see where I've sort of ranked them. And yeah, like I said, it's just an opinion-based thing, like even more so than other sort of tiering lists or whatever. There's no way to quote-unquote objectively say which game you enjoy more or less or whatnot, and I love all of these games, well, other than Heroes, and I love Fire Emblem just in general. And my opinions about these games change, they bounce around. Maybe, a year from now, the ordering will be different, and I'll have Three Houses even higher, or, Path of Radiance and Sacred Stones will swap, or, Fire Emblem, my opinions on it are always evolving, but thank you so much for 1,000 subscribers, and look forward for more to come. And if you haven't already, I would love for you to mark your calendar. I'm doing a charity stream on the 18th. I would love to see you there. It's simultaneously a 1K subs celebration and a Pride Month celebration. And yeah, y'all have a wonderful, wonderful day, night, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. And be kind to each other. Bye-bye.